When you are new to security architecture, it is easy to fall into the idea that every risk has one correct fix, and that if you cannot implement that fix, you are stuck. Real systems rarely offer perfect options because constraints show up everywhere, including budget, legacy technology, operational limits, and competing business needs. That is why architects must be able to choose alternative mitigations and compensating controls that still reduce risk in a meaningful way, even when the preferred solution is unavailable. The tricky part is that not every control that sounds good actually reduces the specific risk you care about, and adding random controls can create complexity without real protection. This episode teaches you how to think clearly about alternative mitigations, how to evaluate whether a compensating control truly interrupts an attack path or reduces impact, and how to avoid placebo security. You will learn to connect a threat to the control's mechanism, not just its label, so the architecture remains defensible and testable. By the end, you should be able to explain why a chosen compensating control is a legitimate risk reducer rather than a comforting gesture. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A compensating control is a safeguard that reduces risk when the primary or ideal control cannot be implemented, at least for now. The key word is compensating because it implies that something is missing or weaker than desired, and the compensating control helps cover that gap. In architecture terms, the primary control might be patching a vulnerability, enforcing strict authorization at the service boundary, or isolating a component into a lower trust zone. If you cannot do the primary control quickly, you might compensate by reducing exposure, increasing monitoring, adding additional verification steps, or limiting what the vulnerable component can reach. The mistake beginners often make is treating compensating controls as generic, like add more logging, without connecting them to the threat's path. Logging can be valuable, but it does not prevent exploitation, and it may not even detect exploitation if it is not focused on the right behaviors. A compensating control must change the probability of success, the impact of success, or the time to detection in a way that matters. If it does not, it is not compensating, it is decorative. Your job is to choose controls that truly shift the risk. To select alternative mitigations intelligently, you first need a clear statement of the threat and the failure condition you are trying to address. It is hard to compensate for a vague problem because you cannot tell what would actually help. For example, saying the system could be hacked is not a useful starting point, but saying an attacker could access sensitive records by bypassing authorization checks on a reporting endpoint is. Now you can ask, what control would stop that bypass? And if we cannot implement that immediately, what else could reduce the risk? Alternative mitigations could include restricting access to the endpoint to fewer users, adding an extra approval step for exports, or isolating the reporting service so it can only query authorized data. Each alternative targets part of the path: who can reach it, what it can do, or what happens when it is used. This is how you keep the conversation grounded in attack paths and behaviors. The clearer your threat statement, the easier it is to evaluate which compensating controls are real. A useful mental model is to think of risk reduction levers as acting on exposure, exploitability, blast radius, and detection. Exposure is about whether an attacker can reach the vulnerable surface in the first place. Exploitability is about how easy it is to succeed once they reach it, such as whether authentication is required or whether validation blocks malformed inputs. Blast radius is about what the attacker can access or change after success, which relates to segmentation and least privilege. Detection is about whether you can notice suspicious behavior quickly and respond before harm spreads. Many effective compensating controls act on exposure and blast radius because they can be implemented at architectural boundaries without changing deep code. For example, if you cannot patch a vulnerable component, you might reduce exposure by limiting which networks can reach it or by restricting who can access the workflow that triggers it. You might reduce blast radius by ensuring the vulnerable component runs with minimal privileges and cannot access sensitive systems directly. Detection controls can be strong when they are specific and paired with response readiness, but they should not be the only control when the threat is high impact and high likelihood. Choosing alternatives means deciding which lever you can realistically move quickly and effectively. Consider a common scenario. A critical vulnerability is found in a widely used component, and patching will take time because of testing and deployment constraints. The preferred mitigation is to patch quickly, but if that is delayed, compensating controls can reduce risk in the meantime. Reducing exposure might involve limiting external access to affected interfaces or disabling the vulnerable feature if it is not essential. Reducing exploitability might involve requiring authentication where previously none was required, or adding an additional check before a sensitive action is executed. Reducing blast radius might involve ensuring the affected service cannot reach internal administrative interfaces, cannot write to sensitive data stores, or cannot execute privileged actions. Improving detection might involve monitoring for the specific patterns associated with exploitation and alerting on unusual requests or system behavior. Notice how these compensating controls are not generic. They are connected to the vulnerability's likely exploitation path and the system's architecture. A good compensating plan often uses more than one lever so that even if one control is bypassed, others still reduce harm. The goal is not perfection, but meaningful risk reduction during the gap. When selecting alternative mitigations, be careful about controls that shift risk rather than reduce it. For example, adding friction to legitimate users, like requiring repeated logins, might reduce some automated attacks, but it can also cause users to adopt unsafe workarounds, like sharing accounts or storing passwords insecurely. Similarly, turning off a feature might reduce exposure, but could push critical work into less controlled channels, like manual email workflows that are harder to monitor. An architect must consider how people will adapt when controls change, because human adaptation can create new vulnerabilities. This does not mean you avoid strong controls. It means you choose controls that are sustainable and paired with clear communication and process adjustments. A compensating control should not create a bigger problem than it solves. This is why risk reduction must be evaluated in the context of system use and organizational behavior. Controls that look strong on paper but fail in practice are not effective compensations. Another frequent challenge is choosing compensating controls for identity and access weaknesses, because identity issues often require deeper changes. If you cannot implement the ideal identity solution immediately, you can still reduce risk by tightening where identity is trusted and how privileges are assigned. For example, you might restrict privileged actions to a smaller set of accounts, require additional verification for sensitive operations, or separate administrative workflows from standard workflows so compromise of a standard account has less impact. You might also ensure that service identities have minimal permissions and cannot be used across unrelated services, which reduces lateral movement. Monitoring can be a strong compensating control here if it focuses on privileged actions and unusual patterns, such as repeated access denials or sudden changes in role assignments. The key is to make compensations that limit the ways stolen credentials can be used and to reduce what those credentials can achieve. Even without changing the entire identity system, you can often improve trust boundaries and privilege scope. That is risk reduction that architecture can deliver. Supply chain and dependency risks are another area where alternative mitigations matter because you cannot always eliminate third-party code quickly. If a dependency is risky, the ideal might be to remove or replace it, but that can be expensive. Compensating controls can include isolating the component that uses the dependency, limiting its privileges, restricting outbound network access, and monitoring behavior that would indicate tampering or malicious activity. You can also reduce risk by limiting the dependency's role in sensitive workflows, such as ensuring it does not handle secrets or direct access to sensitive data stores. Another approach is to add verification steps in the workflow, such as validating outputs or requiring additional checks before actions are committed. These are architectural ways to treat a dependency as less trusted, which reduces impact if it behaves unexpectedly. The general idea is to assume that dependencies can fail or be compromised, and to design containment around them. Containment is a powerful compensating concept because it limits how far a problem can spread. When you cannot control the internals, you control the boundaries. It is also important to distinguish compensating controls from compensating narratives, which are explanations that make people feel better without changing the system's risk profile. Statements like, "We trust our users," or "This is internal so it is safe," are narratives, not controls. They may reflect intentions, but they do not enforce behavior, and they often fail under real conditions like credential theft or insider misuse. A real compensating control changes system behavior or system exposure in a measurable way. For example, segmentation that blocks traffic is a behavior change. Least privilege that prevents writes is a behavior change. Monitoring that triggers response actions is a behavior change. When you choose alternatives, you should ask how you will validate that the control works, because testability is how you separate real controls from stories. If you cannot describe what should happen when an attacker tries the path, you may not have a true control. This testability mindset keeps architecture decisions honest. It also makes reviews easier because you can demonstrate what protection exists. Documentation is part of selecting compensating controls because it ensures the organization understands what is missing and what is being used instead. A compensating control implies that the primary control is not in place, so you should document the gap, the chosen compensation, the expected risk reduction, and the plan to revisit the primary control. Without this, compensating controls can become permanent by accident, even when they are weaker than desired. Documentation should also capture the assumptions the compensation relies on, such as the ability to enforce network restrictions reliably or the effectiveness of monitoring. If a compensating control depends on operational response, then the organization must be ready to respond. Otherwise, the control is weaker than it looks. Good documentation also helps testers know what behaviors to verify, such as confirming restricted access paths or confirming that privileged actions generate audit records. This closes the loop between design and validation. The goal is to keep compensations from becoming invisible, because invisible compensations cannot be managed or improved. The biggest lesson in selecting alternative mitigations is to stay focused on the risk mechanism. If the threat mechanism is unauthorized access, then your control must affect authorization enforcement, identity trust, or access paths, not just add general monitoring. If the threat mechanism is tampering, then controls like integrity checks, change control, and restricted write permissions directly reduce risk, while unrelated controls do little. If the threat mechanism is denial of service, then resilience measures and rate limiting are more relevant than confidentiality-focused controls. This seems obvious, but in real projects, people often pick controls based on what is easy or familiar rather than what matches the threat. As an architect, you should be able to explain the causal chain. The threat works like this, and the control breaks the chain here. When you can do that, you can also compare alternatives based on which part of the chain they affect and how strongly. That is how you choose compensating controls that truly reduce risk. In the end, alternative mitigations and compensating controls are not second-rate security if they are chosen thoughtfully and validated carefully. They are a normal part of architecture because constraints are real and systems evolve. The key is to avoid placebo controls by insisting on a clear threat statement, choosing controls that move exposure, exploitability, blast radius, or detection in a measurable way, and documenting what is missing and why the alternative is acceptable for now. When compensating controls are paired with a plan to implement the primary control when feasible, they become a bridge rather than a dead end. This approach keeps security practical without giving up on rigor, because you are still reducing risk deliberately, and you can still explain and test the protection you have. That is what it means to select alternative mitigations that truly reduce risk. Not perfect security, but real, defensible improvement aligned to the system's actual threat paths.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.